Chapter 10 Blueprint for Immortality Part II. The fourth key to the door for immortality: a golden rule society under one world government, a new trilateral commission under Christ consciousness. Quote, public opinion, through the aid of an able organizer and leader who will organize and direct the efforts of a golden rule society, the object of which will be to move the President and Congress into action. By Napoleon Hill. Let's define some titles of official responsibility as they stand today. Plenipotentiary, a person, especially a diplomat, invested with the full power of independent action on behalf of their government, typically in a foreign country. Ambassador, an accredited diplomat sent by a country as its official representative to a foreign country. Minister, a head of government generally used to achieve, convey, or administer something. Christ consciousness. In this instance, the writers portraying these words to mean precisely not the rulership under an accepted, perceived individual deity, but a conscious mass awareness, a mastermind, if you will, that can create a golden rule society. A new generation of people must grow up in our world that have and continue to fully integrate these universal principles with the awareness and desire to create and bring about the secret to immortality of eternal beauty and youth, as Nikola Tesla envisioned. But as he explained, it is inexorable agents that are preventing the mass consciousness or the thinking and present awareness that is preventing us from making this quantum leap. These energetic webs will resist the change or the force of this new knowledge, but that it is time and persistence that will gradually modify human thinking. To clarify this point, we must now become aware that the energy matrix program known as Christ consciousness can essentially operate under any one individual at any point in time in the space-time continuum. This is why many avatars have been recorded to appear at certain points through our historical record to distribute reminders of universal policy. Through the past 200 years, this influence is becoming more obvious. To illustrate, we can consider that the physical universe works as the hardware of a massive computer. Within all its components, there are software programs that run and facilitate the practical functions of such computer. If a virus were introduced, there are search programs or executive programs that will establish code to remove or rewrite codes for optimal operation of the computer. The Christ program, in essence, has always existed and will continue to exist in order to help the universe's mainframe to run a reality simulation as smoothly as possible. This allows for the players of this game to make progress so not one of the sheep of the fold gets lost forever. So when these terms are used within this book, please be aware that it is always in reference to a consciousness or a software program that helps to direct our steps in the proper direction, prosperity and abundant life. In essence, that universal policy is enforced through its components to help prevent mass software disruption. Plenipotentiary of Christ consciousness. The key words of this definition are connected to the stipulation that a single person or group of people have invested in them full power for independent action on behalf of a government. Therefore, people may be given the honor by their respective leaders to represent them when they are sent to use diplomacy when dealing with other representatives of other countries. Diplomacy is defined as the profession, activity, or skill of managing international relations, typically by a country's representatives abroad. The most basic understanding of the word diplomacy is the art of dealing with people in a sensitive and effective way. Then the question does come up and is worthy of examination in the light of the laws described thereof. Is the center and focus of the entire Bible's message that of following the pattern of Christ consciousness? A representation worthy of replication? Why? Most of the world is at odds with universal policy or the natural rulership, which can potentially create the foundation for a golden rule society. It is preventing or resisting the creation of a government with true leaders and representatives for this world that will help establish this movement. As you read this book and apply its principles, you will be met with overwhelming amounts of evidence proving that this world is controlled and manipulated by powerful forces beyond our ability to grasp under our present matrix of awareness. Thus Jesus was forced to respond to a governor, quote, "My kingdom is no part of this world. If my kingdom were part of this world, my attendants would have fought that I should not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from this source," end quote, taken from John 18, verse 36. As we examine the scriptural references, we can see that Christ's consciousness was never of this world, but was sent as plenipotentiary, invested with tremendous power to speak on behalf of an outside paradigm or government that it came from. For what? Now there is a judging of this world, now the ruler of this world will be cast out, end quote, taken from John. Strong and powerful diplomacy is now being put into place and exercised by foreign powers. The Christ consciousness operating through Jesus has come to conquer per se by infusing trust and power in its ability to supersede this world's social systems. He's also not doing it of his own merit, but his power and authority as a plenipotentiary is strongly supported by the most fundamental laws of the universe and their originator. Essentially, it is the energetic program that acts as a force to help individuals come to the apex awareness of their creative ability or Christ consciousness. There have been many through history who have displayed this awareness, and their teachings, like these principles, are timeless. Unfortunately, we have been robbed of our perceptive powers through the energetic manipulation of our connection through both fields of energy, defined and not defined by time and space. So whether it is through our immediate five senses or covertly through the manipulation of wave frequencies in the air, our thoughts are being influenced to conceive that there's nothing more but this world. These ministers are not coming here to destroy unjustly and indiscriminately populations of innocent people, but that ultimately will establish a takeover by fulfilling the promise. Quote, "In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a government that will never be destroyed, and this government will not be passed on to any other people. It will crush and put an end to all these governments, and it alone will stand forever," end quote, taken from Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. In chapter 11, we will discuss how a foundation was helped to be established precisely on the 4th of July in the year 1776. The Declaration of Independence was a reflection of universal policy, and in the last few centuries, it has been undeniably demonstrated the positive impact that this government has brought upon the world. The time is now to disconnect from the negative input and output this world's rulers are trying to progressively shape us into. We must align ourselves to the laws of the universe as described by empirical evidence, so we may unplug by developing habits of behavior that will prepare us to qualify to become members of the coming true New World Order. In fact, we can become collectively an energetic blueprint that vibrates so high that our matrix awareness of particles defined by time and space will be shaped gradually and modified by time to the reality which will work for the foundation to create this desired and most needed paradigm shift, a golden rule society under a one world government. So like citizen rights and privileges may be given to potential residents, we must either exercise our will to qualify for those future benefits or continue on the despondency of this world with its negative patterns of behavior, ultimately finding ourselves disqualified and unfit from such promised new world. At which point we may never attain life eternal, peace and security, But like a cancerous body, we will just rot away and be either isolated without remission or just completely removed from the entire body of energy. The worst case scenario is if we find ourselves fighting against those who wish to establish universal policy. Then the question we must each personally face, for when we are faced with these positive forces and observe a takeover, whose side will we find ourselves taking? The word Christ or Messiah is closely related to the word plenipotentiary. The word Christ or Messiah means anointed or chosen, if you will, as someone nominated by a higher authority to be a successor or as a leading candidate for a position of responsibility. It is an appointment into an office of power and authority. Likewise, when the context of the scriptural reference emphasizes Jesus as being the Messiah or Christ, for by this reference we learn of his invested power to fulfill the universe's will to align our creative reality to its most fundamental law, then we can see that his appointment was to a powerful position of governance and diplomatic influence. Ambassador and minister under Christ consciousness. An ambassador uses diplomacy and goodwill to build relations with countries in which there is open diplomatic relations. For example, Jesus operating under the influence of Christ consciousness and his most basic essential pattern of behavior has fulfilled diplomatic responsibilities in connection with the scriptural reference. Let's compare the responsibilities and duties of an ambassador as described by the U.S. Embassy's Code. For the role of an ambassador is described as the following. Quote, in most countries with which it has diplomatic relations, the U.S. maintains an embassy, which usually is located in the host country's capital. The U.S. also may have consulates in other large commercial centers or in dependencies of the country. The chief of mission, with the title of ambassador, minister, or charge the affairs, and the deputy chief of mission, a head of mission's country team of U.S. government personnel. Responsibilities of chiefs of mission at posts also include 1. Speaking with one voice to others on country's policy and ensuring mission staff do likewise, while providing to the President and Secretary of State expert guidance and frank counsel. Christ consciousness as operating program through Jesus' ambassadorship was proved as he focused his attention on universal policy, laws and principles defined by the most essential laws of physics. His prime role when on earth was to essentially construct consulates for the people to be in contact with the pre-established organized embassies. For what purpose? Congregations that would uphold the mastermind of like-minded individuals whose sole purpose became to replicate the disciple-making work throughout the then known world. The congregations would integrate what was then known as the Hebrew Scriptures with the newly founded edification of Jesus. This organization's purpose was centered on the idea that of a coming new world where God's will be done as it is in heaven, also upon the earth. Congregations or embassies were to be established among every nation that is considered sovereign. Its constituents were to replicate the policy established by this representative from the foreign government, and thus warn people of its coming influence for failing to uphold the universal laws of justice. Thus, Jesus' ministry was closely and mainly patterned to the subject of government, the kingdom of God and its establishment upon the earth. 2. Directing and coordinating all executive branch offices and personnel. The various established congregations or government consulates had an inner circle membership or a governing body of members, also called elders. This governing body were the earthly founders and main representatives of the main ambassador or plenipotentiary, whose job dictated to leave and report back to the motherland on the progress of the mission. These were known first as the 12 envoys. It was a cooperative liaison of direct mediators for newly converted members of the establishment for the new government councils, or ecclesiastical building assemblies, churches or congregations. We could have just as easily described that Jesus and his disciples founded the Christian church. Unfortunately, these terms have become misnomers to most people of the world and have become devoid of true meaning. But by helping to emphasize that just like governments will establish embassies throughout the world to establish influence, so in the same manner through a series of actions and active common denominators, the authority and influence of now appointed plenipotentiary influencing planet Earth has been propagated as well through a parallel commission. Thus, friendly relations have been established legally, without having to use force of invasion or covert means of creating coup d'etat to create a takeover. This ensures that people's lives are protected, where chaos and civil war is averted as a result of diplomatic requirements. In this manner, people are influenced through the use of a propaganda machine or a system for the proper dissemination of policy. The laws of justice call into account that the inexorable agents which prevent a mass from changing suddenly its velocity will likewise resist the force of the new knowledge until time gradually modifies human thought. As illustrated by the dialogue in the Matrix, we must understand that most of the people's lives are so inert and so hopelessly dependent on the present system that they will fight to protect it. They act as enemies of universal policy, but they don't have to be, and could become viable subjects and supporters of this upcoming new establishment. So the renewed terminology can restore powerful recognition by helping people understand and grasp that words like church, minister, and pastors in reality are timeless titles and tools that help to uphold the highest law of the universe. The fundamental laws for immortality. They are closely related to government, appointed officials, and public servants, for their roles have parallel responsibilities and their buildings uphold the same ideals. The executive branches of the world's governments enforce the law. The legislative branches have the power to make laws. Finally, the judicial branches of governments help to interpret the law. In like manner, these governing bodies within these consulates help to interpret and enforce the already established law, the natural laws of the universe. This ensures the propagation of foreign policy to the masses as it is still currently happening today. This dissemination of knowledge and policy is helping millions qualify to become members of the new global information network under the new governance led by this new plenipotentiary or new prime minister, Christ consciousness and the quintessence of the one who upheld the role of Jesus. This entire systematic structures of government and its policies help to fulfill the following roles and duties of an ambassador. Number 3, cooperating with respective countries' legislative and judicial branches so that respective countries' foreign policy goals are advanced, security is maintained, and executive, legislative, and judicial responsibilities are carried out. 4, reviewing communications to or from mission elements. 5, taking direct responsibility for the security of the mission, protecting all respective countries' personnel on official duty and their dependents. 6, carefully using mission resources through regular reviews of programs, personnel, and funding levels. Under the current paradigm of control and governance, this world's government establishment only exists due to the proper application of public funds, mainly taxes. The governments are required to properly use these funds for the entire mission and propagate its sovereignty. In a similar manner, constituents under this new Christ consciousness program encourage new potentials into alignment, and thus the new system of diplomacy was financed mostly by funds volunteered by those who accepted the new promised establishment. The kingdom of God then was upheld by its new members high in mind, since not only did they have to pay taxes under their already established home country's government, but also was set aside any extra funds to support the new arrangement. Their energetic resources, once sacrificed, helped them to qualify progressively to become citizens of the new kingdom. Jesus was quoted as giving these instructions, quote, "Also, I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of their own righteous riches, so that when such fail, they may receive you into the everlasting dwelling places. The person faithful in what is least is faithful also in much, and the person unrighteous in what is least is unrighteous also in much. Therefore, if you have not proved yourselves faithful in connection with the unrighteous riches, who will entrust you with what is true? And if you have not proved yourselves faithful in connection with what belongs to another, who will give you something for yourselves? No servant can be a slave to two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will stick to the one and despise the other. You cannot be slaves to God and to riches. End quote, taken from Luke. The fast growth of this new arrangement was driven forward by volunteer funds rather than by compulsive taxes. For the laws of physics tells us that what is focused on and nurtured consistently must expand, and that whatever we put out must come back to us. This process then would reinforce this newly established consulate to fulfill the authority of the plenipotentiary, for anything that was sacrificed for the new program had to come back to its members in the form of more benefits and resources. Then, a momentum cycle would ensue and take over like a massive snowball effect. Thus, exponential growth took place in a relatively short time. Like a massive pyramid network, the policy would appropriately be applied and upheld high for the sake of the mission statement and its vision. Quote, in the final part of the days, the mountain of the house of Jehovah will become firmly established above the top of the mountain, and it will be raised up above the hills, and to it the nations will stream, and many peoples will go and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of Jehovah, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will instruct us about his ways, and he will walk in his paths. He will render judgment among the nations, and set matters straight respecting many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning shears. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, nor will they learn war any more. End quote, taken from Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. Is it plausible to accept as fact that the role of the United States as diplomatic power and influence is a foreshadow of what the world could become? Is it not obviously observable that the diplomatic system of the U.S. Constitution has created a nation of 50 states united peacefully under the universal policy of God? Have not many nations been instructed about his ways and walked in the same pattern of governance, creating the same positive outcome for themselves? Have not the 50 states, which could easily have become individual countries, beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning shears? Have not these 50 nations, as states, put away their swords and learned war no more? Is it then not also plausible to accept the fact that even though the whole planet is still divided, that the unanimously decision of the world's governments to establish the same government worldwide could create the same results? Has not in fact this quantum leap been aptly demonstrated that principles found within the U.S. Constitution help to bring the mountain of God to be firmly established above the top of the mountain, raised up above hill-like nations? Have not nations streamed and continue streaming into the United States and nations like it, for they offer unprecedented freedom? For as defined by the U.S. Constitution, has not the modern world now prospered beyond the understanding of past generations and other nations, in contrast to those who do not uphold universal policy? In Chapter 11, we will explore these questions and how universal policy and influence from providence or Christ consciousness was a force that helped to make the world a quantum leap of progress. A movement where we saw the world lifted from an abject mental and physical poverty to a world of unprecedented, never before seen freedom and abundant prosperity. There is absolutely one more concept that must be considered. This new vision cannot be fulfilled by just having an able rulership with power and authority sitting on a figurative throne per se. Neither can the success system of a powerful mastermind and its replication process be the key to everlasting life in youth. This final key in its most basic components has three parts: its leader, the system, but the third part has to do again with more inexorable agents that prevent a mass from changing suddenly. Why? Jesus explained it plainly. Quote, "Nobody sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old outer garment, for the new piece pulls away from the garment and the tear becomes worse. Nor do people put new wines into old wineskins. If they do, then the wineskins burst and the wine spills out and the wineskins are ruined. But people put new wine into new wineskins and both are preserved." End quote. The first and final set of inexorable agents, the error of our quintessence. This concept relates to an obscure fact in which there may be much debate, but by using enough deductive reasoning and examining as many facts as possible, then we can narrow down the determination of the nature of concepts. For example, if we look at our physical bodies, we have examined that it breaks down from body parts to cells, cell parts to molecules, then atoms, and finally energy. So we can say that our body is nothing but a form of collective energy. Obviously, we know all there is to know to the point of realizing this is what we know so far. So like everything that has been discussed up to this point in this book, these concepts will continue to be expanded upon much deeper into the future as more scientific understanding of the physical universe continues to unfold. What we mean by the error of our quintessence is our most basic component that makes us aware the I is fundamentally flawed. This is most likely the reason we age and die. What is it being implied by the word concept of the awareness of the I? This is in connection with the question that progressively is being continued to be asked by the general populace throughout the millenniums. Who am I? What am I? Why do I function? Why am I aware of me? How can I know I am unique and not just some robotic replica? These are all common questions that deserve an answer, for it is questions like these that makes us different from the animal kingdom, which operates through mainly instinct. The answer to these questions will help us to define who we really are to its most basic definitions. The movie Avatar and The Matrix give powerful descriptive illustrations of these concepts, and we are encouraged to consider these movies as points of strong reference. Are we our body? Can we say that we are our biological body? Let's ask, does it sound correct when we say, "I am my arm," or "Do I have an arm?" Am I my brain, or do I have a brain? Am I my heart, or do I have a heart? We all know deep inside that we are not those things because we know we always point to those things as personal property. It is the same idea when we think of things like my couch or my TV. We say, "I have a house, I have a car." So in the same way, we say we have ownership of those things, therefore we own our body. It is scientific fact that our body renews its cells about every 7 years, at which point we have a whole new body. But we are very much still aware that we are still ourselves, and our awareness of our quintessence is still intact, and therefore we know we are the same person. Quote, "And Jehovah God went on to form the man out of dust from the ground and to blow into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living person." End quote. Taken from Genesis. The scripture does seem to suggest that the first man was not a living person, or his record of life did not start but until the breath of life was infused into the body that was to complement Adam. Body and energy were needed to complete that life and create Adam, For even in the scripture reference, it is emphasized that twice the life of Jesus, his quintessence or consciousness, was transferred into a new body, a physical and then a spiritual one, operative bodies under their current matrix of energy. So the answer, we are not our bodies. Then are we our thoughts? There is a statement that has been coined by René Descartes, where he said, I think, therefore I am. This denotes also to the idea that our quintessence is not our thoughts. Since we also refer ourselves as having thoughts, then our ability to have thoughts, memories, concepts, and mind pictures, including every conceivable form of thought, helps us to discern and conclude that probably they are also only our property. We can illustrate it by examining the concept of choice. Let's suppose that a woman is being courted by two men from two different countries. One is Mark and the other one's name is Jay. One lives in England and the other one is from Australia. Brittany has a choice to decide to move to either Australia or England to further develop one of their relationships. Or maybe both men decide to move close to her vicinity to establish potential relations. Scientists are stipulating that there is the possibility that at a quantum physical level, Brittany can and will make both choices since they are both potentials. As if our decision-making abilities were just an illusion and the second we have a choice to make, then our life is progressively splitting into an infinite amount of choices based on an infinite amount of potentials. They are suggesting that our lives continue to create an infinite amount of parallel universes, one where Brittany decides to be with Mark, and the other parallel universe where she decides to be with Jay. Therefore, it is emphasized that her quintessence, or the things that makes her, Brittany, her consciousness and quintessence, is also split into an infinite amount of times. But this implies that we are nothing but empty vessels defined by our internal natural response to external output, just a collection of memories based on experiences being accumulated to the point of death. We must come to understand that once Brittany decides to go to England to be with Mark, or to be with Jay in Australia, or even stay home, her entire course of future memories and experiences will become completely different from the other potential choices. But regardless of her decision, she will still be Brittany and her quintessence will be intact. We can illustrate this concept further this way as well. Let's suppose that like using the copy and paste tool in a computer writing software program, we could copy our body and entire memory bank up to this point. You go in a machine, capsule A, and then the technology copies and pastes you on the other side into another machine, capsule B. You both come out of each capsule and examine there is an exact replica of you on the other side. But you realize he or she is no longer you. This is because you will both go on to make different decisions based on their personal quintessence and bodies defining time and space. Both consciousness could not sustain the exact time and space, for there's two of you now. Essentially, not the same person. So like identical twins, triplets, or quadruplets being born, they are essentially different people. All of them will go on to develop a complete set of different experiences, people, and circumstances. Their memory banks will be much different even though they have the same looks and bodies. And even though they may see perfect replicas in front of each other, they each know and are aware of each other's quintessence, their own personal awareness of the I. We know we are all unique. Quote, his spirit goes out, he returns to the ground, on that very day his thoughts perish, end quote, taken from Psalms. Then the dust returns to the earth, just as it was, and the spirit returns to the true God who gave it, end quote, taken from Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 7. The Hebrew terminology emphasizes that in these contexts, after the physical body returns to the dust, then the spirit or breath of life comes out or goes forth to where it came from, God. But in connection with all this data, then can we conclude that we are not our thoughts, but that our thoughts are only a result of what we are? The reader may decide of his own volition, for it is a concept that must be clarified, for the universal laws as defined by the field of quantum theory do give ample evidence that our particles that complement our body do split an infinite amount of times based on all the potential up until now. For even the scripture reference does emphasize we certainly are not our thoughts. For if we stop thinking the moment we die, then are we the spirit itself that goes out and goes back to God? I think so, but let's examine further evidence that we are not our thoughts. So, are we spirits? There are some interesting dichotomies that give clear understandings of the possibilities of the answer to these questions when we examine certain stories and word context in the scriptural reference. One is found in the story of Jesus resurrecting his friend that had already been dead for 4 days. In this account, we find Jesus explaining to his companions that he was to travel back to awake his friend Lazarus, for he had gone to sleep. He was obviously talking about his death. Throughout the context of the accounts that describe Jesus' ability, Jesus knew he could have healed him from a distance, for he already had done that with others. But why did he not cure his friend before his death? The story gives tremendous data and perspective to what is possible. Many people believe that people go to heaven when they die to live in eternal bliss. Certainly, if this is the absolute truth, then surely Lazarus, as Jesus' close friend, would certainly have gone to heaven to live in eternal bliss. For 4 days he must have been in total ecstasy and happiness. But the account by definition tells us that this is far from the truth. Since Lazarus had been dead for already 4 days, then could we say that he was already watching his own body rot from heaven? Was he already enjoying the companionship of other relatives or angels and experiencing joy and perfect happiness and satisfaction? If that is true, then Jesus did something out of character, because he decided to pull him out of heaven, to put him back into his body, back to live a life full of pain and misery in comparison. Obviously, this was not the case, for Jesus had in actuality resurrected him. Lazarus was dead, meaning asleep, as he illustrated, conscious of nothing at all. Quote, "There is hope for whoever is among the living, because a live dog is better off than a dead lion. For the living know they will die, but the dead know nothing at all." End quote, taken from Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 5. Quote, "The dead do not praise Jah, nor do any who go down into the silence of death." End quote, taken from Psalms 115:17. Quote, "For the grave cannot glorify you, death cannot praise you. Those who go down into the pit cannot hope for your faithfulness." End quote, taken from Isaiah 38, verse 18. So up to this point, we understand that even though we may not be conscious of anything at all when we die, we do also understand that something that makes us unique as individuals comes out and goes back to God, our spirit. Is our spirit our quintessence? Is it who we are? The scriptural reference suggests to us that it is true. Another definition for the word spirit describes this word as a quintessence of a highly refined substance or fluid thought to govern vital phenomena. Vital phenomena then is translated as an energetic object of a person's perception, what the senses or the mind notice. The Greek terminology denotes it as the thing appearing to view. It is the uniqueness and powerful phenomena of the power of observation connected to us. To illustrate, in the Matrix movie, Neo is explained and trained to do whatever it takes to survive. For when their minds were hacked into the computer Matrix program and were killed in the process while experiencing the Matrix reality, they themselves would die in the real world. The body cannot live without the mind. Therefore, a mind cannot live without a body. Jehovah had responded to Adam after stealing property that was not his, the forbidden fruit, "For dust you are, and to dust you will return." This cannot possibly mean that we become a big fat zero in the space-time continuum, but just like Jesus did to Lazarus, we are just waiting for a future resurrection. Quote, "Do not be amazed at this, for the hour is coming in which all those in the memorial tombs will hear his voice and come out, those who did good things to a resurrection of life, and those who practice vile things to a resurrection of judgment." End quote. Taken from John chapter 5, verse 28 and 29. Quote, "And I have hope toward God, which hope these men also look forward to, that there's going to be a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous." End quote. Taken from Acts 24, verse 15. This adds a powerful insight to the validity of our unique quintessence and God's ability to resurrect us. For if our quintessence becomes non-existent, and God decides to create a new body just like ours in full detail, with every memory and possible neural pathway, then how could we know it is us and not just a replica of us? Certainly, once such a person is recreated, they will know to be us because he or she has no choice but to know it is us. But it is not us, for our quintessence is gone, and it is just a new quintessence being infused into a replica of our mind and bodies. So just like the illustration of the machine replicating us, the second person is an entirely different being and essentially not us. Like a burning candle flame just lighting a different candle, but essentially not the same candle nor the same energy force. This makes a strong suggestion that also our entire energetic blueprint is also recorded into our spirit. Thus, if we die and then are resurrected, our asleep spirit can be infused into a new body and become a living, operating being again. A new body then can have our original quintessence that we received when we were conceived. But let's regress for a second. Since we also do not want to be dogmatic about anything here, for it is plausible we are somebody else when we leave our present identity. Lazarus' identity may be just that, an identity. To illustrate, scientific research has explained to us that energy can never be destroyed, but that it only changes shape. Spiritual philosophy has explained to us that we are made in the image of God. God has always been conceived as eternal, not having a beginning or an end. God has been described similar to the forces of the universe, ever present everywhere, or omnipresent and omniscient. Quantum mechanics and its laws describe that us as energy are spread thin through all time and space. In essence, omnipresent, but we are just not aware of it. This could mean that our present identity is just that, a set of people, circumstances, events, and situations that we identify with. But that it is possible to experience a different identity through an infinite amount of different people, circumstances, and events defined from birth to death. Obviously not just one birth and one death. More research on this could give evidence to the powerful awareness of what many spiritual and ancient manuscripts have taught, that we can reincarnate and come back and experience a different identity if we feel we are done with the present one we are experiencing. So why fret so much about biological immortality if we are eternal beings anyway? What is the purpose for myself as the author writing this book and bringing this message to you now reading this? Ultimately, I would love to be a catalyst or at least an influence to move humanity into the awareness and the plausibility of biological immortality and the expansion of our species as a force for good throughout the planet, just like Tesla had in mind. But why? So humanity can come to be in a place where we can choose to have, be, and do whatever we desire without the fear of death, where death is a conscious choice and not a circumstance forced upon us. Why? Because I agree with Nikola Tesla's observation of our nature, that eternal beauty is the aching need of humanity. Why? Has it not been our observation over that of our personal lives to be defined by various forms of enslavement? Have we not observed how ourselves and loved ones live out our lives defined by despondency and unhappiness, and the experience of feelings of overwhelming disempowerment? In conclusion, we are our spirit, probably. Earlier, we pointed out to Jesus' statement of not putting new wine into an old wineskin, for it would just burst open and the new wine would be wasted. This means that, unfortunately, that just like our entire energetic blueprint is recorded in our quintessence, then putting our quintessence into a new body would just recreate and replicate the same outcome. Death. Our every negative pattern, whether inherited or developed through our lifetime, will permeate the newly formed body's energetic field and deteriorate it. For the low frequency of our negative programming is damaging and destructive. This gives powerful emphasis that our nature is flawed and must be repaired or cleaned out. In this book, it is the author's absolute intention to build objectivity and restore truth from the scriptural reference. For the following connection of the previous information of our essence supports the next axiom, as it is supported heavily by everything previously discussed throughout this book. It has been suggested that a close examination of the entire biblical reference should be considered in the light of the newly discovered laws of quantum physics to create posterity. For what? To give at least circumstantial evidence that this widely accepted spiritual reference does have basis in reality as a source of viable information without leaving room for prejudice. This is not to say that everything in it is clear in connection with its various stories and large selection of reading material, but that just like the laws of physics have been timeless, so does the many of the principles found within have been shown to be timeless as well. Also, I am acknowledging that many of the so-called laws of God or principles found within these various accepted spiritual references no longer fit into the description of what quantum mechanics has shed light to be universal policy for the creation of a golden rule society. We must also acknowledge that many books and publications may go out of print in just a few years, but the Bible has survived millenniums for its practical value. But we must also acknowledge that it has been used as a tool for control and repression, and because of its misuse and dogmatic approaches by many so-called representatives of God, it has wreaked much havoc on humanity through past centuries. The quintessence of the one who identified as Jesus in the New Testament warned of what will happen to his message by stating the following. Quote, "The kingdom of the heavens may be likened to a man who sowed fine seed in his field. While men were sleeping, his enemy came and oversowed weeds in among the wheat and left. When the stalk sprouted and produced fruit, the weeds also appeared. So the slaves of the master of the house came and said to him, 'Master, did you not sow fine seed in your field? How then does it have weeds?' He said to them, 'An enemy, a man, did this.' The slaves said to him, 'Do you want us then to go out and collect them?' He said, 'No, for fear that while collecting the weeds, you uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And in the harvest season, I will tell the reapers, first collect the weeds and bind them in bundles to burn them up. Then gather the wheat into my storehouse." End quote. Taken from Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30. What did it all mean? He explained. The sower of the fine seed is the Son of Man, Christ consciousness. The field is the world. As for the fine seed, they are the sons of the kingdom, but the weeds are the sons of the wicked one. An enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is a conclusion of a system of things, and the reapers are angels. Therefore, just as the weeds are collected and burned with fire, So it will be in the conclusion of the system of things. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out from his kingdom all things that cause stumbling, and people who practice lawlessness, and they will pitch them into a fire furnace. End quote. It is important to acknowledge that there may be times where universal policy demands that the prosperity of those who uphold it be protected from those who do not uphold the highest forms of principle. Quote, "A man who stiffens his neck after much reproof will suddenly be broken beyond healing. When the righteous are many, the people rejoice. But when the wicked rules, the people groan." End quote. Taken from Proverbs chapter 29, verse 1 and 2. People may fret and dispute the validity and integrity of religious organizations, but it is the fact that people still uphold respect and honor for the New Testament general positive instruction. As we may find most of the time that the only reason religious organizations become widely criticized, it is due to their failure to uphold to what they claim to represent and practice, principles of good found in many of these scriptural references. Religious organizations' failures does not in any way take credibility away in the book's reputation, but that just like a mirror, we can contrast its teachings to the validity of people's claims to practicing its principles, whether collectively or individually, for the biggest minority is the individual. We also want to acknowledge that specific beliefs about so-called holy scriptures and who God is have been detrimental to the well-being and progress of humanity. Beliefs such as 1. Holy Book X or other scripture is the one and only inspired word of God ever. Belief 2. That people's perceived gods or authorities are the only true and inspired authorities and completely infallible. These beliefs have been a force against the laws of nature and universal policy. What makes things work for a peaceful and happy species? More wars have been campaigned in the name of gods, angels, and demons than any other reason in history. More freedom and prosperity has been destroyed in the name of gods and devils than anything else in history. The Dark Ages was an absolute testament that biased dogma is destructive to principles of liberty and freedom. But what does the general credence in these historical spiritual references have anything to do with the fourth key to immortality? As suggested before, the author is absolutely not in any way desiring to be dogmatic about anything in this book. New studies in the field of science or technology could completely squash and discredit this entire philosophy. But it is highly unlikely, for we are basing it mostly on empirical evidence and established facts in the field of science. Therefore, if we thus far have accepted that laws of quantum physics and principles of life as clearly defined throughout the scriptural references, then we have to consider the probability that every story and account, or at least most of them found within, are viable and have had basis on reality. This brings us to the story of Adam and Eve, the supposed first human couple. Who were they? How did they think? How did they feel? How did they act? Is it true that they introduced such a thing as sin into the entire genome? What exactly is sin? To bring clarity to the story or allegory, we must realize that this entire account is teaching us about energetics and laws of the physical universe as they operate in connection with us. But first, it must be acknowledged that the story of Adam and Eve could be one of four perceptions. First perception, an illustration to explain specific perceived notions about life. Second perception, a story highly edited and made to be believed without question for control and manipulation. Third perception, a myth or story that factually took place but was heavily distorted to fit preconceived notions of how life started on the planet. And the fourth perception, a myth or story that factually took place but currently only symbolizes our memory of the first version of human species, but obviously more than just two were created. I am heavily inclined to suggest to the reader that all four perceptions are factually true. But so as to not deviate from the main point, these topics will be discussed and explored more heavily in a future book. We know for a fact that humans have lived more than 6,000 years. Archaeological and scientific research has proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is the case, and for that reason, a debate will not be started here. Exact mathematical equations have proven that the universe is 13.772 billion years. There are billions of stars in our Milky Way galaxy with trillions of planets orbiting those stars. There are also trillions of galaxies that form clusters of galaxies, which form superclusters. And within those galaxies, ever more stars and bodies that could complement planets with intelligent beings and civilizations like ourselves. To believe within this premise that we are the only creation to exist or have existed ever, or that we are the only physical intelligent species God created ever in this massive, ever-expanding universe is but absolute and resolute ignorance. It is also written that everything that has happened will happen and has already happened and will happen an infinite amount of times. This is the foundation of our creative ability. Thus yours and our individual lives exist currently because in essence it was programmed into the universe to be so from its foundation. Our life as it stands now has happened because its possibility was already programmed into its matrix. So when we deny the undeniable, overwhelming evidence of intelligence outside of our sphere, it's like denying that the law of gravity exists. This fact then allows for questions like the following to come up. Have we been visited by intelligent life forms in the past? What about now? Are we being observed or manipulated by them? Is all the scriptural stories of beings coming down from heaven with great power and ability just the limited description about highly advanced beings through the perception of ancient and limited civilizations? Thus, do they claim them to be God or the gods? This is highly complex, and more of it will be explored on Blueprint for Immortality, Book 2. Sin and imperfection. This topic will be explored under the following premise. If we have been taught by our past generations that we were born in sin, what is the definition of sin? Thus, if sin exists, then did God create it? If we are inclined to say that God did not create sin, then does that mean something can exist that God did not create? And thus he has no control over it, for he did not create it. Would that indicate that if this were to be true, that God then is not all-powerful? But if we are inclined to believe that God created everything, including sin, then he also created what we have perceived to be evil, bad, or negative. For if the laws of physics stipulate that everything that can happen will happen, then must we not conclude that God also created the laws of physics that allow for what we perceive as negative things to occur, and thus the foundation for true free will? This topic also must be discussed under this second premise. For if God created the myriads of possible universes with all its stars and planets, and thus the laws of physics explain that everything that can happen will happen, then we must conclude that there must be other intelligent beings outside of our sphere of universal influence. Thus, original sin is not what we have made to believe without question. For if God created sin and imperfection, then its possibility is fully integrated into the fabric of space and the matrix of both particles defined by time and space and particles not defined by time and space, where otherwise it could not be. Then, does that mean that these other civilizations outside of our sphere of influence are also prone to sin and imperfection? Is it possible for these beings to sin against God? For then we will have to ask, have and did other beings sin against God across the universe? How many times? How many different civilizations have sinned? And do they all have their own so-called Lord and Savior? Then, under this premise, to believe that in this infinitesimally small point of time and space, in contrast with the rest of the universe, what we now call civilization on Earth is the only place where evil or sin has been, is but a silly notion. If it were true, then this would have to mean that everywhere in the universe but planet Earth is paradise. Of course, common sense lets us know that this is far from the truth. These conclusions then forces us to acknowledge one obvious and glaring truth, that it is extremely unlikely that the gods described in the various texts such as Yahweh, Jehovah, Allah, or Jesus as the only true God and only God, but that they are most likely highly advanced beings from outside of our sphere of influence or planet Earth. Essentially, Genesis chapter 1 describes an extremely vague and primitive description of how the universe came to be, but that Genesis chapter 2 suggests gods as planting the Garden of Eden and recreating already established life on Earth. It describes a point in time infinitesimally small in contrast with the lifespan of the physical universe. The Genesis account is but a small premise to describe the influence of beings outside of our globe, in essence, establishing dominance and rulership thereafter. This book is not written to debate historical accuracy of spiritual books, but it is the choice of the author to convey context for the principles contained within. It is all designed to expand or stretch the reader's mind to a new perception, evidently being demonstrated through empirical evidence. What empirical evidence? The author will suggest the reader to search online viable sources that refer to the ancient astronaut theory. For what purpose? The true definition of sin and imperfection. This will help us to see that it's not sin against God that brings destruction, but negative thinking and using our creative ability to harm ourselves and others. We can perceive also for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, and that for the world of the relative, our world, to function as it stands, God did create all its components. Completely understanding that our quintessence is marred or not, and whether our very consciousness is corrupted or not, will help us know where we stand in relation to being able to put together the final key to immortality. We define that faith is, in essence, thinking about what you want with positive assurance, and that fear is also, in essence, thinking about what you don't want with assurance. We either have faith that we can have or achieve something with certainty, or we have faith that we cannot have or achieve something with certainty. One is positive and the other is negative. One is a high frequency and the other vibrates much lower. The question then does come up as to the nature of our collective frequency. If at some point in creation we existed as beings with absolutely no negative thoughts, yet introduced into our essence, then our exercise of prolonged vibrations to such nature of thoughts must have been almost impossible. We do know it was absolutely possible, for as we know from Newton's third law of motion, that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, and the following text shows how this law was allowed to operate in our individual lives as it respects to our free will. Quote, "Thus Jehovah God made to grow out of the ground every tree that was pleasing to look at, and good for food, and also the tree of life in the middle of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and bad." End quote. There's much debate as to the exact ramifications of both trees. But one thing is certain. One promised life and the other one promised knowledge. How do we know? The story explains that once the couple decided to take from the tree of knowledge of good and bad, God responded like this, quote, Jehovah God then said, Here the man has become like one of us, in knowing good and bad. Now, in order that he may not put his hand out and take fruit also from the fruit from the tree of life, and eat and live forever. End quote. The emphasis is clear. The possibility still was even acknowledged by the caretaker of this garden, that they could live forever by eating of the fruit from the tree of life. We can stipulate that the fruit might have been infused with energetic properties that would allow the human body to continue in its fortitude forever as long as it was persistently nourished by the tree's fruit. But we certainly don't know for sure. This may also suggest that their bodies were also made in a way that will progressively decay like everything we find in nature, but that as long as they were able to partake of the tree of life, they will be able to live indefinitely or for much larger periods of time. Regressing though, we must acknowledge in the same manner that as far as we have perceived it, it is highly unlikely that the person known as Jehovah was in essence the God of creation. But most likely Jehovah is the name that represents a group of beings representing themselves as our gods, managers, or ministers from outside our sphere of influence, planet Earth. But we can come to this conclusion by seeing the facts. Mainly, that sin and death are fully integrated into the physical universe, thus a way to perpetuate for an individual's life to exercise free will by living with the choice to die or not to die. But that with the tree of life, we could exercise our willpower to continue to live forever until we will become able to access God's essence within us, for God is in all things. Therefore, it is only a matter of time before we become aware of life within us. We are energy, and energy cannot be destroyed, but only change form. Adam and Eve then are described as beings not allowed to partake from the tree. The result then was a creation of degenerative negative frequencies, ultimately deteriorating their entire energetic blueprint to their own detriment. Also an inheritance for their progeny for centuries to come. Our entire quintessence was doomed from conception because the energetic patterns from our first parents heavily programmed their quintessence. Our manipulated DNA frequency was then programmed with extremely low vibrations and thus programmed our entire existence with habits of fear, greed, and betrayal, all original frequencies generated by the brain transmission of what became their most prevalent thoughts. Any hope to gain biological immortality is now founded on the hope of getting access to the tree of life, for it will perpetuate our existence in life. Then we will have all the time in the world to exercise faith and develop stronger patterns of behavior, much more positive than the garbage that has been handed down to us. A joke of an inheritance of sickness and death. So where is the tree? Enter Prime Minister of the universe. Jesus, under the influence of Christ consciousness, said, quote, Let the one who has an ear hear what the Spirit says to the congregations. To the one that conquers, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. End quote. Taken from Revelation chapter 2, verse 7. It is the plenipotentiary and main ambassador and now Prime Minister of the government of our universe that has complete authority and access to the Garden of Eden and the tree of life. Timeless symbols of what is absolutely possible for humanity to accomplish. But what does he mean by, to the one that conquers I will grant to eat? And more significantly, where is the paradise of God? The following scripture does shed clear insight to where the tree of life currently resides. Quote, I have to boast. It is not beneficial, but I will move on to supernatural visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in union with Christ who, 14 years ago, whether in the body or out of body, I do not know, God knows, was caught away to the third heaven. Yes, I know such a man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, God knows, who was caught away into paradise and heard words that cannot be spoken and that are not lawful for a man to say. End quote. Taken from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. Here again, the scriptural reference gives emphasis that our quintessence can be either pulled from or most likely stretched from the current vibrational body house. The visions were either in the body or out of the body, or it also suggests that his spirit or quintessence was caught or stretched away in the body or out of the body. Either way, the context leaves no room for any other possibility, but that it was his experience of such phenomena only determined by one or the other, in the body or out of the body. With this in mind, the fact that his experience could have been out of body suggests that his awake quintessence was literally in the immediate locality of paradise as it stands within time and space. On the other hand, it also suggests that if his experience was in the body, then his visions were of the literal paradise. It could be stipulated that, like a telescope that uses quantum properties, such technology would allow us to observe the distance between the interstices of the dimensional field constructed and defined by the energetic spectrum of light. For example, the scripture reference tells us that the Garden of Eden was somewhere close to the Euphrates River. Let's suppose that we somehow knew exactly where the garden used to reside. The reference tells us that paradise is currently on the third heaven. If we were to vibrate as high as that playing field, then it would be the law that we will find ourselves traveling between the interstices of energy that divide the dimensional fields. It has been previously mentioned, scientists are suggesting of the possibility for parallel universes. In essence, we will be traveling through time and space, both vertically and horizontally, under the same point. Although we disagree that our quintessence could not possibly be defined by just choice, this does not mean that the particles of energy that exist in duality that compose the entire universe do not have their parallel counterparts. The laws of physics defined by quantum mechanics thus explain that this is true. Particles of energy can be influenced to vibrate higher or lower based on external influence. As such is the case, we can deduce slightly that if we live in the lower levels, say energetic heaven -10, then we would only have to vibrate high enough to access the third heaven. In essence, we either climb the steps or take an elevator that will take us from base floor number 10 to the third. But as mentioned previously, it is Prime Minister of the universe or Christ consciousness who holds authority, and he will only give access to those who qualify, those who have conquered. We must align our creative abilities to universal policy. To clarify this point, we must now become aware that energetic matrix program known as Christ consciousness can essentially operate under any one individual at any point in time in the space-time continuum. This is why many avatars have been recorded to appear at certain points in our life to distribute reminders of universal policy. To illustrate, we can consider that the physical universe works as the hardware of a massive computer. Within all its components, there are software programs that run and facilitate the practical functions of such computer. If a virus were introduced, there are search programs or executive programs that will establish code to remove or rewrite codes for optimal operation of the computer. The Christ program in essence has always existed, will continue to exist in order to help the universe main frame to run a reality simulation as smoothly as possible. This allows for the players of this game to make progress so not one of the sheep of the fold gets lost forever. So when these terms are used within this book, please be aware that it is a reference to a consciousness or a software program that helps to direct our steps. In essence, the universal policy is enforced through its components to help prevent mass software disruption. How do we conquer? What do we conquer? Do we need training to conquer? These and more are good questions, for as a minister he can qualify us to receive access to a tree of life, and finally attain biological immortality. Hear what the Spirit says to the congregations. Another way of saying this is we must take in instruction and training as a prerequisite by plugging into the system of replication created and established by the quintessence or operative consciousness of Jesus or other who taught and emphasized the same teachings while on earth. These systems of training were propagated through the consulates or embassy buildings that represent the universal government or Christ consciousness. It is the foreign entity that Jesus represented as its ambassador or plenipotentiary. These are terms that describe the nature of his office and public service as he implements and executes universal policy as defined by the universal laws. We must be instructed of his authority and the spirit that operates for those who exercise the universe's most fundamental laws. This is the only way to conquer. Conquer what? We must conquer the world's influence in our mind and its negative inputs as defined by the collective quintessence of the lives of the entire populace. It is the entire blueprint of energy that permeates the programming of people's spirits, the negative feedback of who they are as they influence the collective brain transmission of the populace. This entire energetic program propagates through the matrix of particles of energy defined and not defined by time and space. Jesus explained it in simple terms. Quote, I have said these things to you so that by means of me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take courage, I have conquered the world. End quote. Other scriptural references give even more insight as to what conquering the world means. Quote, for this is what the love of God means, that we observe his commandments, and yet his commandments are not burdensome, because everyone who has been born from God conquers the world. And this is the conquest that has conquered the world, our faith. End quote. Taken from 1 John chapter 5, verse 3 and 4. Quote, I have fought the fine fight. I have run the race to the finish. I have observed the faith. End quote. Taken from 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7. Quote, I am writing you, little children, because your sins have been forgiven you for the sake of his name. I am writing you, fathers, because you have come to know him who is from the beginning. I am writing you, young men, because you have conquered the wicked one. I write you, young children, because you have come to know the Father. I write you, fathers, because you have come to know him who is from the beginning. I write you, young men, because you are strong and the word of God remains in you, and you have conquered the wicked one. End quote. Taken from 1 John chapter 2, verses 12 through 14. Quote, furthermore, the world is passing away and so is its desire, but the one who does the will of God remains forever. End quote. Taken from 1 John chapter 2, verse 17. Observing and living up to the physical laws of the universe is doing the will of God. For as we observe and live up to them with positive goals in mind, we will always fulfill the golden law. Our services to others to improve their lives by creating in other people's lives desirable circumstances will allow us to exercise the quintessence of moral law. Our persistence will continue to help us maintain integrity as we uphold the fundamental laws for immortality. Loving others as we love ourselves will help us to continue exercising our faith, our ability to sustain positive frequencies for a prolonged period of time, to reprogram our spiritual nature. But one more thing is required from Prime Minister of the Universe, the reprogramming of our DNA and the reformatting of our spirit to the point where we could access life within us. Our quintessence must be reset from its inherent negative programming that has been passed down through generations. We will now examine how the matrix program known as Christ consciousness has used its trilateral commission as plenipotentiary, prime minister of the universe, and its ambassadorship to gradually modify the vibrational blueprint of our world for the better. For its programming continues to modify human thoughts, so its inexorable agents that prevent us from making the quantum leap to eternal life may be removed. Prime Minister administers life. Quote, "If the dead are not to be raised up, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we are to die." End quote. Taken from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 32. This short and simple sentence defines the entire axiom of what is stipulated to be all religious faith. For if it is a lie that the quintessence of Jesus, acted and influenced by Prime Minister, was not resurrected, then any belief in biological mortality is also a lie. As we have examined the laws of physics as stipulated by quantum mechanics, these allow room for the possibility that Jesus was indeed a real lifetime character who was infused with incredible powers of will. His advanced technology was able to control weather, heal illness in an instant, even raise up dead people. A close examination of Prime Minister's energetic vibrational imprint by observing the nature of his thoughts, words, actions, and habits of response and initiative can give us ample evidence of his authoritative legal disclosures. This includes the seemingly impossibility of his personal resurrection. But why would he have to give up his life to help us attain eternal life, and for that matter, forgiveness of our so-called inherited sins or errors? Why would the universe or God need a scapegoat to supposedly forgive or just forget about seemingly serious errors committed through our lives? Why does the life of a sinless person with a clear quintessence, free from fear, have anything to do with the ability to just forgive the conscious negative vibrations that dominate people to live in fear? Are we just not victims of unfortunate circumstances and situations? Our inheritance, a death sentence. The words sin and forgiveness of sin have now become misnomers. Why? Because in reality, what we owe is taxes. We have failed to give proper recognition to the highest authorities of the universe, mainly natural law and universal policy, for it is required to live in harmony with them for a life of prosperity and peace. Since our entire energetic blueprint vibrates and permeates all time and space, then such vibration of light also reaches the source. But are we paying back with illegal monies? Is our entire nature an improper application of the laws of the universe? We already discussed the nature of true worship. It is nothing more than giving the proper, merited recognition that someone or thing deserves. We realize that the proper recognition of God is to follow and observe its most fundamental laws of the universe. They are mainly closely connected to absolutely persevering in the golden rule, including loving God. Hard cash is used as legal tender. It is backed up by the acceptance or recognition that money has value based on its wide and excessive circulation. We almost pay taxes, for if we don't, we will pay a higher price with our property or even our freedom. And how much more the energetic taxes we must pay to the Creator. Jesus did emphasize that this was absolutely the case when it came to the nature of our so-called sins. On the famous Lord's Prayer, he said when considering God in prayer, "Forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors." He also gave an illustration, quote, "That is why the kingdom of the heavens may be likened to a king who wanted to settle accounts with his slaves. When he started to settle them, a man was brought in who owed him 10,000 talents. But because he did not have the means to pay it back, his master ordered him and his wife and his children and all the things he owned to be sold and payment to be made. So the slave fell down and did obeisance to him, saying, 'Be patient with me, and I will pay back everything to you.' Moved with pity at this, the master of that slave let him off and canceled his debt." Taken from Matthew 18, verses 23 through 27. Interestingly, the king canceled the slave's debt. The slave was hopelessly in debt with absolutely no means of paying the king back. The story of Adam and Eve, it seems, was used to illustrate to us that negative patterns of behavior can be passed down and thus create a continual cycle that creates pain and suffering from generation to generation. By pulling away our vibrational focus from God as the source to our perspective focus, we take away what rightly belongs to God, but mainly to ourselves. Failing to uphold universal policy is a decision. These decisions also program our future and our unborn potential progeny so that their energetic frequency of vibration would then be set on autopilot to vibrate away from the source once conceived. Failure to pay taxes was then perpetuated into the human genome. Thus we have become hopelessly in debt, for we could only cancel our debt with our lives. This is why the scriptural reference explains that the wages sin pays is death. If we think about it, when we are personally offended by others, we feel hurt or underappreciated, for we have not received the proper recognition of the value of our lives. We know we have value and are worthy of respect and love, for that is how we are made. When we fail to receive that from others, or we fail to give that to others, the stipulation teaches us that we in fact become indebted to them when we offend, or them to us when we are offended. We demand retribution with interest unless we decide to cancel such debts. That is why it was emphasized in the illustration of the king and the slave that we should just as easily forgive others' failures to give us proper recognition in the same way that God had done the same by bailing us out of our debt. For if we fail to do so, then our debts will just be reaffirmed in the same manner that we have reaffirmed the debt that we may feel others owe to us. In essence, we must accept the fact that any perceived damage is self-created, mainly from a subconscious level. By acknowledging that we create our own reality, we can begin to manifest better situations and patterns. For just as easily as the king can forgive large debts, then how could we owe anything to someone who owns it all? Why would a king who has it all require more? So by accepting that the universe just naturally responds to our energetic patterns of programming, then we know that it is only by asking for forgiveness for any perceived damage in us or outside of us. For example, a baby who lived during World War II could not have consciously created or consciously chosen for the outbreak of World War II. But everyone in the planet had a slight negative vibratory frequency that added to the collective creation of a second world war. But what could possibly be in a newborn baby, and by connection the whole world, that could collectively create such violence? We must remember that the nature of energy will manifest into physical reality when it reaches critical mass. Then the war is an obvious mirror reflection telling us that there's a little bit of violence, intolerance, and bias in all of us. So when we hear reports of war, murders, violence, kidnappings, and other perceived evils, we must accept responsibility that it is a reflection of negative energetic patterns in all of us as individuals and collectively. We may exercise our mental abilities and pray that we be clear of such internal code, in essence, ask for forgiveness. Our only hope for progress from such degenerative coding is for God to cancel our debt by committing to His legal disclosures. The nature of these disclosures will guide us back to paying back our debts by accepting the proper government bailouts that are being rendered. The key is we must qualify and accept the new government program that will absolutely cancel our debts. Thus, Christ consciousness can and will always provide what is necessary for the assurance of life. Life is and will always be. Life always will find a way. This is God's guarantee that we will never be lost within the universe's programming forever. Legal disclosure for loss of property. We have been made to consciously make decisions to legalize by our own consent and free will, to make and create our own laws. Since energetically our choices affect our quintessence, our ability to rely on the pre-established plenipotentiary already ruling throughout the universe was made void and cancelled. No longer citizens of that universal kingdom, the human race was and has always been at the mercy of those who have chosen exile and separation from that arrangement. Thus, the human dream in connection with the universal policy in relation to mankind's future plans was severed. We became lost property and potential value for the kingdom of the universe. This made for a legal disclosure or decree, a new arrangement for a way back to regain what was lost. The quintessence of mankind fully restored to its original purpose. This new legal disclosure then was progressively revealed through the centuries for those who were deemed potentials. These potentials would prove their desire to return to the source by doing their best to uphold specific instructions given at epochs. Our entire historical reference is in essence a transcript of the positive and negative consequences of those who have submitted to universal policy or not. It is a progressive demonstration of the application of diplomacy by the will of the universe as defined by the laws of physics. The scriptural reference explains that it is the will of God that will reveal this legal disclosure. Through a series of legal disclosures, which were made legitimate by envoys sent to transfer information to those potentials, the answer was revealed. Through these procedures, legal agreements were made between potentials and envoys by the legal authorities entrusted to the representatives of the universal government. As orders were recognized and carried out by the candidates, then further instruction was further passed down for progressive fulfillment. For the most part, the Hebrew scriptures denote the emphasis of the positive and negative results, the outcomes that singular and collective prospects of the kingdom experience as they faithfully carry out the universal policy given to them, or when they fail to do so. These legal disclosures gave specific instructions that would eventually return to the source to those who listen. The potentials will be brought back in time to the original state of affairs that was supposed to originate and perpetuate the human race. The results and benefits of plugging into the universal policy were described in the preceding chapters. It is encouraged to the reader to reread Deuteronomy chapter 28 verses 1 through 14 to get the essence of what was supposed to become the collective reality of its benefactors. Tremendous benefits thus needed to be perceived by potentials from the kingdom of the universe to remake and refute the already wired previous decision. Transactions of purchase and exchanges of goods needed to be implemented on the lost property in order to recoup what was considered loss. So like a business investor who sees potential in a business going bankrupt due to incompetent management by previous ownership, progressive restoration and investment will have to be made to save the business concept. In this case, mankind needed some serious change of management and ownership to one that was more competent and able. This is where the role of Prime Minister had to come in, and his office had to funnel and siphon valuable resources and energies to bring about this radical change upon the human race. No expenditure has been held back for even the value of the lives of the many avatars operating has been put into contract under legal disclosures. Willingly, like a seriously committed businessman, Prime Minister gave up everything to ensure the success of his trilateral commission for the fulfillment and completion of the project. So what is the result that is being kept in mind by the highest forces of the universe? What is mortal man that you keep him in mind, and a son of man that you take care of him? We don't know for sure, for it would certainly take an eternity to progressively experience what is the real value of a human life. But what we do know for sure is what that legal disclosure has progressively revealed to us up to this point. Quote, "With that I heard a loud voice from the throne and say, "Look, the tent of God is with mankind, and he will reside with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them, and he will wipe out every tear from their eyes, and death will be no more. Neither will mourning, nor outcry, nor pain be any more. The former things have passed away." End quote. Taken from Revelation chapter 21, verse 3 and 4. Quote, "For the vision is yet for its appointed time, and it is rushing towards its end, and it will not lie. Even if it should delay, keep an expectation of it, for it will without fail come true. It will not be late." End quote. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 3. It is the absolute promise that the Christ consciousness matrix, as it continues to operate through chosen individuals through time, will culminate in the final vision for mankind and will be fulfilled. So just like Nikola Tesla envisioned the secret for immortality, youth, and beauty, so has also this scriptural reference denoted to us carefully throughout, all the way to the conclusion of his extensive record. Thus, when we choose to accept the full value of our repurchase or reinvestment, then our personal individual lives as potentials of the new kingdom will prosper like a fully renovated business enterprise. It may sound bizarre for humans to be referred as corporate entities, or even the present system of things of rulership has deemed all human life exactly that, corporate property. The legal disclosure is a guarantee through the universal policy established by God and by its highest constituents of government. The legal procedures have been implemented, and the payment for the proper exchange of goods has been ratified by the highest courts of justice. The decree by the authority of God has been put into effect, and it has no choice but to transform particles of infinite possibility to become what God originally envisioned. It must come true, period. It will ultimately be up to us to finally qualify to become citizens of that government. Plenipotentiary will then establish a foundation for a peaceful takeover of this old world, bringing tremendous benefits to all who align their quintessence to the universal policy. The final axiom, the re-engineering of our DNA genome. Billions of people have paid the cost of fear and negative thinking with their lives. Every day, millions of people still do. Whether it's timeless death due to illness, disease, pain, or accidents, they are all a co-creation of the collective human genome. We do not qualify to receive any from the tree of life, for if our quintessence were to continue vibrating negatively, we will continue to create chaos and misery, and we will become a destructive black hole of negative energy for life. We will progressively become the antithesis of light particles, and like matter being clashed with antimatter, we would only become a neutralizing force for creation. The law is, we must die, for we are essentially corrupted energy in vessels of fear and a destructive force to life. But as we were promised through the various legal disclosures, our debts have been cancelled through Prime Minister's resignation and dissemination of the code found in his quintessence. For what purpose? To bring potentials back to perfection, for perfection is only defined by the ability to know that a tool or thing is being used properly according to the purpose it was created to accomplish. Perfection is only relative to the instruction manual that ensures the proper use of a creation. Creation's instructional program is defined by the laws that are relevant to our present, and so when we come to become in disharmony with it, we become faulty products and must be recalled to the source. It is stipulated by the warranty that at the point of discovery of faulty equipment, immediate repair and restoration must be implemented. It is also true that due to misuse, equipment can become damaged beyond repair, and as such it is scrapped for its remaining usable value. This absolutely can happen to us, and thus our identity could become beyond repair, and thus we can just come back to the source for original reformatting. At that point, we may lose the personal identity we presently identify with. As we may recall, our entire genetic code, including our neural pathways, vibrate into the ether and permeate the interstices of energy of particles defined and not defined by time and space. Christ consciousness while on earth, many avatars has thus far vibrated its entire genome and resonated his entire codified vibrational blueprint. The ether must have been completely saturated by the high frequency of the nature of such beings. Thus we can get closer to accessing powerful concepts, cognitions, and discoveries that we can integrate into our quintessence for the proper application of the laws of the universe. For as we exercise our will to align ourselves to the universal laws, by law of magnetic attraction, the powerful attractive forces will bring in like-minded thoughts, ultimately bringing us closer to Christ consciousness. In essence, we will progressively vibrate higher, and the ability to act on fear will be also progressively be removed from our consciousness. For even our spoken words will always be marked by positive reflection. Quote, "For we all stumble many times. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able to bridle also his whole body." End quote. Taken from James chapter 3, verse 2. On the other hand, if we fail to appreciate this provision and bailout, then we will become universal junk. Rejecting repair will only separate us even further from the apex creation through the space-time continuum. The world of peace and security will continue to be beyond our grasp, for its resonance of existence will continue to be beyond our current vibrational point. This will be true for us whether in the body or out of body. As potentials, the entire human race has been repurchased and given another chance at doing it right this time. Quote, "Do not be amazed at this, for the hour is coming in which all those in the memorial tombs will hear his voice and come out, those who did good things to a resurrection of life, and those who practice vile things to a resurrection of judgment." End quote. Taken from John chapter 5, verse 28 and 29. Quote, "Your dead will live, my corpse will rise up. Awake and shout joyfully, you residents in the dust, for your dew is as the dew of the morning, and the earth will let those powerless in death come to life." End quote. Taken from Isaiah chapter 26, verse 19. Quote, "From the power of the grave I will redeem them, from death I will recover them. Where are your stings, O death? Where is your destructiveness, O grave?" Taken from Hosea chapter 13, verse 14. Quote, "Martha said to him, I know he will rise in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who exercises faith in me, even though he dies, will come to life." End quote. Taken from John chapter 11, verse 24 and 25. Quote, "And I have hope toward God, which hope this man also look forward to, that there's going to be a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous." End quote. Taken from Acts chapter 24, verse 15. Quote, "For if we have faith that Jesus died and rose again, so too God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in death through Jesus." End quote. Taken from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 14. These scriptures, quoted strongly, suggest of the possibility for our quintessence to be brought back to life. It also suggests that there will come a time when we will get the opportunity to exercise faith in our abilities so as to perpetuate our personal identity. So that's it. There is absolutely no hope for mankind to access biological immortality if there is no technology to access people's quintessence and bring them to a newly created body. And even if we were able to transfer our quintessence into new bodies through new technological means, our negative quintessence will continue to become worse and destroy life around us if universal policy continues to be rejected. Our very presence will become destructive to what is good. Our ability to access and reset our quintessence to perfection based on our free will depends on our ability to access the tree of life. We must become aware of highly evolved consciousness that may direct us to access it. All scripture quoted here is to emphasize that the possibilities for immortality, its existence, are not beyond plausibility. Thus, we could create a situation where we could recreate ourselves to be in a place and time where we won't depend on others to access the so-called rivers of life or trees of life. Quote, "And he showed me a river of water of life, clear as crystal, flowing out of from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of its broadway. And on this side of the river and on that side there were trees of life producing 12 crops of fruit, yielding their fruits each month. And the leaves of the trees were for the curing of the nations." End quote. Taken from Revelation chapter 22, verse 1 and 2. Tying it all together. The catch is we must qualify and accept the bailout. How? We must align our lives to the most fundamental laws of the universe. This is how we must conquer, so when the time comes, where Prime Minister is given full authority and influence over Earth's affairs, we can qualify to receive citizenship. We must submit to the universal policy implemented and now soon to be enforced. Will its programming give us access to a tree of life then? We must plug into the educational systems previously discussed. We must read books, listen to audio material, and attend meetings on a regular basis with like-minded people that reinforce universal policy and governance in their own lives. We must continue to affect our thoughts, words, actions, and habits back to the source so we can qualify to eat from the tree of life. No one will do it for us. We are the ones that must conquer. The choice is up to us.